Hi, I'm Greg Pratt with the Chicago Tribune. I'm also the author of The City is Up for Grabs, How Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot Led and Lost the City in Crisis.
This book that you wrote starts with a really interesting anecdote about the mini mayor, a young child here in Chicago who went viral for a Halloween costume, just an oversized clothing which matched Mayor Lightfoot's penchant for wearing clothes that were just a little bit too big for her. Describe like the point A of that story and the point B of that story and how it reflects Lightfoot's relationship really with the city of Chicago.
So when she was a baby mayor in 2019, this child had dressed up like her and it went viral, and the mayor's office caught on, brought the kid in for some pizza, and they had a nice little meeting. It was very sweet, very appreciated. By the end of her term, when she had lost re-election, was at her last city council meeting, Mayor Lightfoot was not as happy with the city, and the city was not as happy with her. They had just rejected her by 85% of the vote. So the mother had brought the child to come see her one last time, and the mayor didn't make time to take the flowers that they brought. And for me, what that symbolized was just the way that she came in with all this hope and promise and inspiration, and she left sort of sulking her way out of City Hall. And it was really, really unfortunate.
One criticism from the end of her tenure that I remember, which was very clarifying, was that she went into this mayorship thinking that she was going to be able to either reform the machine or work around it. And really the machine in Chicago doesn't really change a whole lot. Is that like a pretty accurate description of the difficulties that she ran into? Because she came in here as a reform candidate to a large degree.
Sure. The reason Mayor Lightfoot won her election in the first place was because Ed Burke got pinched by the feds, and it became a referendum on who is connected to Ed Burke and who is connected to the machine. As an outsider and as a former federal prosecutor, she was able to ride that wave. Once she took office, she abandoned some of those efforts at aldermanic prerogative in particular, partly because aldermen, including friends of hers and allies of hers, didn't want to give up their power. For them, it's a great thing that they get to control zoning in their ward. And they say, we know our community, we know the city, we know our neighborhood, we are in the best position to do this, which there's some truth to. But the aldermen, for a long time, there's almost 40 of them that have gone to prison in the last 30, 40 years. And what they have used to go to prison was this. And Mayor Lightfoot lost her focus on that issue and wasn't going to win that fight unless she expended a lot of resources. So she eventually just dropped it.
And the book gives a couple of examples right at the beginning of her tenure where she was pretty naked about saying one thing on the campaign trail and just flat out denying that she was going to pursue any of these goals. Was there like a few others along those lines as well?
Well, on one of the interesting little moments is I take the reader into her meeting with Mayor Emanuel after she had won the election. And she comes into City Hall to meet with Mayor Emanuel, talk about transition stuff. And he's worked up about, he wants her to know that an elected school board is bad from his perspective. And she had campaigned on an elected school board. So Mayor Emanuel talks to her about this, and at the end she says, oh no, I'm not for that. And Rahm and his people are flabbergasted because they don't trust her. They don't trust her because they had appointed her to the police board. She had told Mayor Emanuel she wasn't going to run for mayor, and then she ran for mayor. So and she thinks that they're a bunch of jerks as well. So they don't like each other. They don't trust each other. And for them, they thought, well, it's a good thing that she's abandoning this crazy school board idea, but also you can't trust her. And they went around telling people that story. And that was one of the biggest examples, because that wasn't just like a campaign promise. That wasn't something she said. That was something she put on her commercial. So for her to switch on that was one of many ways that she just campaigned on one thing and then did something else, and on core issues as well.
When I was refamiliarizing myself with the 2019 race, I had forgotten about how much of a landslide Lightfoot's win was. Do you think she would have seen that same level of success against any other of the candidates like Mendoza or Daley, or was Preckwinkle sort of like a special weak candidate?
She would have beat any of those candidates pretty handily. So Susana Mendoza at the time was connected to Ed Burke, and so that was going to be a problem for her. Bill Daley just looked like he didn't want to be there. You know, Bill was a terrible candidate. He could be, not saying he's a bad person, but he was a terrible candidate, ran a terrible race. Preckwinkle had just attempted to ban soda pop as a joke. You know, she had just done the pop tax, which was this giant tax. She was very unpopular. She was unpopular with all sorts of people, partly because of the pop tax, partly because of Burke. She campaigned poorly. She was reading off a script for some reason everywhere she went, even though she'd been in politics for about 40 years and did not need to be reading from a script. So Lori would have beat, those are the big candidates, and she would have beat the pants off of any of them in 2019.
When you start writing about the transition and the beginning of her tenure, I almost felt like there were a few chapters missing because it seemed like she had a real change in demeanor when it came to working with the aldermen, working with the media to a certain degree, just kind of a standoffish, my way or the highway character. Do you think the idea of the mandate that came from winning 3/4 of the vote affected her perception of just the power she was supposed to wield in Chicago, or do you think she would have led like that if it was like a closer race?
Her personality is her personality, and her personality is that she's a puncher. She's a federal prosecutor. She's going to beat up on the people she feels like she needs to beat up for. She's a fighter. It was not, so a lot of politicians don't understand why they won a race. They don't understand why they got elected, how they got elected. And Lori Lightfoot did not win because the voters sat down and said, wow, she's smarter than Toni Preckwinkle. She's better looking than Toni Preckwinkle. She's funnier than Toni Preckwinkle. It was a change election, which means it was about who is new and who is not new. And that's it. Once if an election, you know, if you're riding a wave that is bigger than you and you win, that's great for you, obviously. She was very happy that night, and you can never take that away from her. But she didn't win because the voters said, I want you to beat up everybody every time you're mad, you know? And I like to say that, you know, if you slap someone upside the head on a Monday, you know, as a society, we don't look kindly on slapping people upside the head, but every once in a while you have to slap somebody upside the head. But if you go around your week and you've slapped 10 people that week, people are going to think there's something wrong with you. And that's the problem that she ran into, is that she didn't know when to slap someone and when to give them a stern talking to. But I do think that the landslide victory was a little cursed, because I do think that she didn't fully understand. And one of the examples I give in the book is that Willie Wilson, the entrepreneur businessman who's very popular on the South Side with black voters, he endorsed her against Preckwinkle. He took her around. Me, Lori Lightfoot, and Willie Wilson went step dancing one night on the far, far South Side, and he worked hard for her. And she threw him away before she was even sworn into office. And she eventually could have used his help.
You have a brief anecdote about her rejecting the idea of working with Wilson on his reparations concept, which I guess some people might perceive as being kind of pragmatic, because what was her response to like not wanting to work through that process of figuring out if reparations made sense for Chicago?
She said she didn't want to deal with some Willie Wilson BS. And by which she meant, you know, Willie was working with some black aldermen on some sort of reparations ordinance, which, you know, I think at the time, Evanston had just done its own version of reparations where they were giving help with housing to black families. And people were kicking the idea around. And she didn't want to do it because she thought it was kind of a waste of time. She thought it was polarizing, and she didn't want to give energy to Willie, who by this point she didn't have much use for. And so it was she was pretty resistant to a lot of new ideas, even some things she ended up doing, like the universal basic income pilot that she put in. For a while, she was fighting with Alderman Gil Villegas about that. He was pushing it. He's a moderate guy, but he's pushing this more progressive ordinance. And she said, I'd rather people work. and eventually she came around on that one too. But this was she's as a leader, she was a centrist. She was middle of the road, and so she was very reluctant to push a lot of change, which is also pretty consistent with being a corporate lawyer.
I always got the impression from her, especially as we were reacting to the summer of 2020, that she wanted to be a little bit more pro-law and order, and maybe not necessarily pro-cop, but pro-law and order than a lot of other progressive mayors that would have been in her same position. But it just felt like maybe she was a little hamstrung by the left-leaning nature of city council or the media that was watching her. Do you get that? Is that a fair assumption that in a different environment, she might have been a little bit more pro-law and order?
No doubt about it. You know, she was a prosecutor. She's very pro-police. I mean, there's an anecdote where after there was the riot at the Columbus statue, she calls a conservative alderman, Matt O'Shea, and says, these animals attacked our police, which is pretty strong language. And I was with her while she was campaigning the far southwest side in Beverly in Mount Greenwood and Beverly during the Southside Irish Parade in 2019. And she's in a room full of cops. Mancow is there. Mancow is wearing some ridiculous boa. And it's a fun time. And she comes up to some cops and she says, I'm going to be good to you. I'm going to take care of you. She's having these conversations. At the same time, she's in other parts of the city talking about police accountability, talking about reforms, talking about racism. And all of this is worthwhile to discuss and think about, but she never found a lane. So one minute she's out there saying to people, these animals attacked our police. The other minute, during the Floyd protest, if you recall, there was an officer who flipped off some protesters and it got caught in a photo. And she gets asked about a press conference and she very heatedly says that person should be fired. And these are very hard things to keep together, because if you don't feel like someone has your back, and I do think on the middle finger, that's probably an overreaction. Yeah. That's, Mayor Lightfoot, sometimes when she's talking about the difficulty of police reform, we'll talk about John Burge, the police torture commander, kept his pension after going to prison. So these are complicated themes, but her inability to pick a lane and to be clearer and to pick her fights better. Like, you didn't have to pick the fight. You did not have to pick the fight with the officer that flipped off some protesters. It probably was worthwhile when you had some officers, if you have a more egregious police misconduct case. But she didn't pick her battles.
You have an interesting anecdote about a conversation she had with Eddie Johnson about trust, which kind of also informs this idea of not being able to pick a lane. Why don't you just kind of briefly talk about that conversation about trust and how it reflected not just her kind of hot and cold relationship with Johnson, but her relationship with police reform in general?
So one of the first things that she says in a meeting with Superintendent Eddie Johnson is, Soup, do you know who I trust in CPD? He says, who? She says, you, and that's it. And she would drop hints about, she has sources in the department, she's hearing certain things. And it really created a tense environment. For Eddie Johnson's purposes, he said, there's 10,000 people that work for this department. You gotta be able to trust more than just one of them. And then one of the first things she did, she was adamant about, was she didn't want to be protected by a Chicago police commander. She wanted to bring in Jim Smith from the U.S. Marshals. And that was seen as widely disrespectful. Superintendent Johnson tried to talk her out of it. She said, that's my guy. He said, okay, because he wanted to pick his battles. But that was a moment of, she wasn't comfortable and trusting of the officers, and that showed.
What do you think that she got right about police reform during her tenure here? It looked like her appointing Charlie Beck as the interim superintendent was pretty productive and positively productive. You made the mention that he kind of took his name out of the running for the top job so that he had the space to make the tough changes. How would you grade her response to police reform, like during her 4 years as mayor? Police
reform is one of the big missed opportunities from her administration. It was a bit of a fail. So she had been a very thoughtful critic of the police department. Perhaps she had been tougher on it as head of the Police Accountability Task Force than was prudent, but maybe she wasn't tough enough. It depends. But she was a very thoughtful critic of issues in the department. And let's be clear about the fact that the Chicago Police Department has a lot of issues. And it has a lot of brave men and women working every single day, but the department also has a lot of problems in terms of training, in terms of safety standards for officers and for civilians and even for suspects. We have a city that lags behind New York and Los Angeles. So Johnson has to go. She makes the change. You know, she was going to change him no matter what, and then he has his incident with the drinking at Ceres, and she brings in Charlie Beck. And she didn't bring in Charlie because they were necessarily aligned on vision. Her deputy mayor for public safety had known Susan Lee had known Charlie, asked him to come in, and he's a legend in the policing ward. And he does a lot of very smart things. He takes away what's called merit promotions, which are perceived as you just give a promotion to your buddy. Whether that's fair or not, that's how they're perceived within the department. And he made some changes on reform that more or less got thrown out by his successor, David Brown. And so that's another example where she wasn't picking a lane. She was just reacting. So they said, hey, we got this guy. He's great. Can we bring him in? And she said, sure. And Charlie Beck's a very impressive guy. But they ended up not following through with a lot of his plans, and it was a real mess.
We haven't talked a whole lot about COVID yet, and we could probably spend the entire amount of time that we've been here already talking about her response to COVID. How would you rank her overall response to the pandemic? And do you think that was more of a deciding factor in her re-election loss than the crime and police accountability question?
So COVID was, in a lot of ways, one of the things she had going for her in Chicago. There were a lot of people that, what her campaign would say is that she pulled well on COVID. Governor Pritzker got reelected on COVID, which was funny because she was not for a lot of the stuff that they did, a lot of the shutdowns. She ended up wearing the jacket for them because she's the mayor, but she didn't want to close down schools. She didn't want to close down businesses. She was concerned that they were overreacting. She and her team would refer to one of Governor Pritzker's outside doctors as Dr. Doom. And then she closed down. The only big shutdown she did was the lakefront. And that was, in retrospect, a mistake. So, and they kept it closed for much longer than expected. So she wanted to run on COVID, but they told her that she was being hit hard on crime. So we need to defend you on crime. We need to have you out there saying that you have a plan. The problem with that was that she hadn't taken steps to make changes. I personally think that if she had fired the police superintendent, she probably would have got reelected because she would have had something to talk about.
One of the things that I kind of noticed going through your book is that I didn't see a lot of repeated mentions of names in terms of like confidants, people that she could rely on as advisors throughout her entire career. You don't even really talk about her wife very much, at least in the first half of the book. Was she kind of a woman alone in a lot of respects in her career? And do you think that informed her combative defensive management style?
It's really remarkable how she had some falling outs with people that she was close to. That her first chief of staff, who was chief of staff for 2 years, they don't talk anymore. She had a falling out with her lawyer, Mark Flussner, who had been a close ally, and they stopped talking. She had a falling out with the deputy mayor for public safety, Susan Lee. She had a falling out. I could go on and on. The mayor couldn't separate personal from work, from good advice, from people working with her. She really struggled with that idea, even with some of her aldermanic allies. And so she would not always make the time to talk to her fellow members of city council. And so, yeah, I think that that's an astute observation of she didn't have a lot of repeat confidants because she was blowing through people. And that was one of those things where, you know, she liked my work when I was tough on Tony Preckwinkle, because I used to cover the county, and I wasn't tough on Tony Preckwinkle because I don't like Tony Preckwinkle and I want to help someone else. That's crazy. That's not what journalism is. I was tough on Tony Preckwinkle because I am tough on whoever I cover. If you became an elected official that I'm covering, I'm probably going to be tough on you. It just is what it is. And when I applied the same standards to Mayor Lightfoot, she took it personal, which of course it never was. I mean, I actually, on a personal level, I like Lori Lightfoot. She's funny. She's very smart. She just lacks some political skills.
How did your access to her change over her tenure? Especially, she was a candidate who did not rely on identity a whole lot during her campaign, didn't really reference it a whole lot, during her mayorship. And then the back half, or the mid-tenure interviews, and she was only going to take questions from Black journalists. How did your relationship as a journalist change? And I guess what was your reaction to becoming a little bit more combative with the press, especially with that, that one sort of like racialized edict for interview subjects?
She famously sent out an email to her staff in 2020. She was mad at me and she said, "I don't want you guys helping him with anything. If he's got a question, you answer it as briefly as possible, but I don't want you proactively helping him with anything." And the poor comms director responds, "Understood, Mayor." And so she had got angry about some stories and decided to banish me from where she's talking. And she ends up having an embarrassment over Anjanette Young, where she attacked me at a press conference, and she was wrong. She was wrong on the facts, and she was wrong on the way she handled it, and she apologized publicly and privately. We sort of started talking a little bit better, and then when she did the Black and brown journalist edict of like, I will not talk to white journalists for this day, I want to draw attention to the lack of diversity. I canceled my interview with her because I'm Latino, and I canceled my interview, and she was mad about that because she felt that I had shown her up. And that was another thing that was just a mistake. It was alienating to a lot of reporters. It was very controversial with a lot of people, and it was just kind of an idea. And one of the things that mayors and governors and people need is a filter of somebody to say, yeah, the idea of that is kind of interesting, but it doesn't work, and don't do it. It's offensive, it's bad, and she didn't always have that. And on that one, there were people egging her on, which was incredible because it was a PR disaster from a mile away, and she ended up even doing an interview with The Tribe, which is a Black Chicago website, where they asked her where she goes to eat on the South and West Side, and she couldn't name a restaurant.
With lacking like a famous political last name, or not coming from like certain expected elite circles like Rahm, do you think as a one-term mayor, Lightfoot runs the risk of not really having much of a legacy, that as we just continue electing more mayors, that she just kind of drift into obscurity? Or do you think there's enough there because she was such a national lightning rod for criticism that we'll be talking about her, for many years, many mayors after her?
We will always remember Lori Lightfoot for the good and the bad, and for some of it, there were positive things. She was a fighter for Chicago. She would advocate for the city. She cared about equity, and some of that is she cared for equity, and that was laudable. That's a good thing. This is a city with a lot of segregation and a lot of problems. She got dealt a tough hand and did the very best that she could to be strong and to be reassuring to the city. She wasn't perfect. Obviously, you can't sugarcoat the fact that 85% of the voters rejected her. But we will always remember, because, when you and I are old and dying, we're going to remember COVID, and we're going to remember the riots, and we're going to remember the time Mayor Lightfoot said this crazy thing about the Italians. She was very... It's just the way that she led, and we will remember some of that positively. I mean, sometimes people today, right now, they're like, "Oh, Brandon Johnson is terrible." There were a lot of people who were closer to her ideology but didn't realize it, and she wasn't able to convey that, and now they miss her. I don't. So it's complex, but she is a personality fitting very much with every other great Chicago mayor, with a Jane Byrne, with a Harold Washington. She didn't have the success of even a Rahm Emanuel of getting reelected. She didn't have the success that some of them did, but she is very much a part of Chicago and this iconic person that came in, raised hell, and left. And people didn't think she was doing a good job at the time, so they switched directions. People will have positive memories. They'll also remember the bad stuff, but they will have positive memories.
You can say pass to this last question because it involves a little bit of mind reading, but how do you think, as now an outside observer, how do you think she is perceiving the Johnson administration, especially considering that his polling numbers now match where she was towards the end of her mayorship? Any thoughts on how do you think she's reacting to how Johnson is running the city?
Well, you don't have to guess, because she has made a couple comments in a couple settings of people come up to her all the time and say, "We miss you." So, she enjoys that schadenfreude. She'll also crack about, at the same time, she's like, well, I don't even ask them, did you vote for me? Because she knows what the answer to that is. I think that anyone who has been in a leadership position in Chicago cares about the city. Rahm cares about the city. Daley probably is still watching and thinking about things that are happening, and so is she. And I'm sure that she's concerned because she's opposed to a lot of the things that Mayor Johnson does. But I know that Mayor Lightfoot, just like all those other people, would like the city to succeed, and that means that Mayor Johnson succeeds. At the same time, she absolutely makes the comment of, be careful what you wish for, because you didn't want me, and look what you got from her perspective.